Well, good evening. It's Wednesday night and time for our catechism class, the Judeo-Christian catechism that we use at the Disciple Center. We're in the section on the covenants. We've been talking about the five major covenants. We began last week going through them more individually, and we looked at the covenant with Noah, and then we looked at the covenant with Abraham. Tonight we're going to look at the covenant that is with Moses, the Mosaic covenant, and then the covenant with David. And we'll take a look at those and how, again, they unfold and are connected to each other rather than replace each other. So let me just, by way of review, um, go back and remind you of the information on the covenant with Noah. The covenant with Noah talks about the world that was, the world that is, and the world that will be. And it's really about the destruction of the world that was and by the flood with Noah. And then God saying, I'm going to make a covenant with the whole creation, with all living things, and that would include us. And I'm going to make that covenant so that I will never destroy the world by flood. I will continue to let the earth have day and night. It'll have summer and winter. It'll have heat and cold, uh, um, harvest, and the sowing time will be sequential. And that will continue as long as this creation goes. I will not destroy it again by a flood. Because of man's sin, I'm going to deal with that a different way, and we'll see that in the other covenants. So that covenant really establishes the uniformitarian kind of principles of the present creation that's relatively stable with regard to predictability and those kinds of things. And so when the bow is seen in the sky at the rain, it is God looking at it and remembering to keep his covenant, us looking at it to thank God for keeping that covenant. Of course, this heaven and earth will end by fire, and then there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the new covenant and the gospel. We followed that up with the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant begins the establishment of God's covenant with a unique people that he will call his people, and he will be their God. And this will begin with Abraham. He called him out of the land, and then he said to him in this covenant in Genesis 17 that I will make you a father of many nations. I will be your God. You will be my people. I will give you this land, this promised land, and it'll be to your descendants forever. And God was going to bless the other nations through the light of this nation that would come from Abraham. And he said, there's a sign for this one. It's circumcision, and you will circumcise your males on the 8th day, whether they're natural born or purchased into your household. Either way, you will circumcise them, and that will be the sign of the covenant. And if that's not done, they will be cut off. And of course, Moses didn't circumcise his son, and God tried to kill him even when he was going in obedience to deliver Israel. And Zipporah did that and associated that with Moses, and now the covenant is in place. So the circumcision of Jewish males is not the Mosaic covenant, it's the Abrahamic covenant. But it carries on into the Mosaic covenant, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about that covenant with Moses, or with Israel, through Moses. And that covenant is found throughout the book of Exodus. It's talked about in Leviticus and Numbers. It really is a covenant that takes up the whole Torah in that sense, and often identified with the 5 books of Moses and the Torah. But I want to talk about it in more specific terms of what it is and why some Christians misunderstand that covenant and think it's been done away with, when in fact it has not. Now, the covenant that God made with Israel after he brought them out of Egypt was made at Sinai, sometimes called Horeb. And then, of course, they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years because they didn't fully obey God and trust him. And so that generation died out and a new generation came in. Even Moses was not going to enter into the land. But at the end of that 40 years, there is a repetition and a renewal of that covenant. And that's really what the book of Deuteronomy is. It's Moses now in the land of Moab, right in that Jordanian area by Jordan, retelling the story of what happened in the Passover, that God had been with them all these years, and that God was going to now bring them into the land as he had promised Abraham, and he was going to give them the land, and that he was going to bless them in the land. But the blessing of them in the land was dependent on them obeying his commandments and his ways. You're not going to be like the Egyptians. You're not going to be like the Canaanites, who I am removing from my land, God says. You're going to walk in my ways. You're going to walk in my statutes. You're going to observe my commandments. And when you do that, I'm going to bless you, and you will be the head and not the tail. And when you disobey me, you will be the tail and not the head, and I will remove you from the land. So the Mosaic covenant is actually a covenant not of salvation. They were saved by the Passover lamb. They were delivered in that sense as the people of God. God had bought them for his own, purchased them in that sense. And now he was saying, you will be my people, I will be your God. And here's how our relationship's going to be. When you obey me, I'm going to bless you. And when you disobey me, I'm going to curse you, so that the nations around you will see that there is blessing in obedience and there is cursing in disobedience. It is not a covenant of salvation. It is a covenant of blessing and a covenant of cursing. Blessing in the land for obedience, removal from the land, and curses for disobedience. And God says something in this covenant that's really important. Now, I hope you'll read chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, where God talks about the blessings. And then he talks about the curses that will take place in their disobedience. He then makes this covenant in chapter 29. He says, the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab, beside the covenant which he had made with them at Horeb. So this is a renewal of this covenant. Moses summoned Israel and said, you have seen what the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt. The great trials which your eyes have seen, great signs and wonders. Yet to this day the Lord has not given you a heart to know, eyes to see, or ears to hear. I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you. Your sandal has not worn out on your foot. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or strong drink, in order that you may know that I am the Lord your God. So God had taken care of them, even though he had not brought them into the land. And then he says, we're now going to enter into this covenant. And he says, it is not with you alone that I am making this covenant or this oath, but with those who stand here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, and with those who are not here today. For you know how we lived in the land of Egypt and in the midst of that nation. And so he says, I'm going to have this so that generations to come, your sons who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a distant land, when they see all of this going on, they will know that this is my covenant with my people. And so he is making a covenant with Israel down through the generations. This covenant is not a covenant just with that generation. It's with Israel. And it is a covenant as long as the sun rises and sets, as long as there is winter and summer. In other words, as long as that Noahic covenant is in place, the covenant with Israel at Sinai and Moab is still in place. It's not done away with by the cross. And we'll talk about that more next week, but it's really important to see that this covenant with Israel is still a valid covenant. Now, what's important here is to read chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, because God says, and Moses says, you're not going to keep this covenant. You're going to break my covenant. I'm going to remove you from the land. And when you get out in the land, you're going to cry out to me, and I'm going to bring you back. In other words, the covenant is not broken by their disobedience. The curses come because of their disobedience. The blessings come because of their obedience, but the covenant remains. So he says to them, so it will be when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I said before you, and you call them to mind in all the nations where the Lord your God has banished you. Because he says, I'm going to remove you from the land. And you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and your soul, according to all I have commanded you and your sons. Then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity and will have compassion on you. And he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. And if the outcasts are at the end of the earth, that is, they're in California, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. And the Lord will bring you into a land which your fathers possessed, and you will possess it, and he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. He will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, so that you may live. And the Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. And you shall again obey the Lord and observe his commandments, which I command you this day. And God will prosper you if you obey the Lord to keep his commandments, which are written in this book of the law, if you turn to the Lord your God with your heart and your soul. And this commandment which I command you is not too difficult for you, nor out of reach, not in heaven, so that you would say, who will go to heaven and bring it down? And it is not in the sea that one would say, who will cross the sea and get it for us? But the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it. Now, that's very important because we see here in the Mosaic covenant the promise of the new covenant. And the new covenant does not replace the old covenant, it brings it to full operation so that they are able to fully obey and have the blessings. That's an important concept that many Christians miss. So we'll talk about that more and what Paul says about that in Romans next time when we talk about the new covenant. But in the covenant with Moses and the children of Israel at Sinai and Moab is a provision that God says, when you've gone through this and it's clear that you can't keep this, then I will make it so you can. I'm going to circumcise your heart. I'm going to change you. And when I change you, I'm going to gather you back and I'm going to bring you into the land and you will obey me in every detail of this covenant and I will bless you and the nations around will see that. They will have seen you cursed and they will see you now in the blessing. And so he says, I set before you today life and prosperity and death and adversity, in that I command you to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. And so the covenant that is here is really a covenant of blessing and of obedience, so that when Israel obeys God, he will bless them. When Israel disobeys God, he will disperse them. But he promises he will not abandon them. As he was with them in the wilderness, so he will be with them in diaspora, and he will ultimately change them and bring them back. And as I said, the new covenant is the extension of this covenant, not a replacement of this covenant. And so Israel agrees to do this, and he promises unconditionally that he will restore them after they break the covenant, and he will return them into the land. And so the Mosaic covenant, very important covenant. And I want to say something about it, because a lot of people think that Jesus came to get rid of that covenant. We couldn't keep the covenant. Now, we Gentiles never had that covenant. That's a covenant with Israel. That covenant with Israel, they couldn't keep. And Paul says that. What they couldn't do, what the law couldn't do, weak through the flesh, God did in sending his son. But Jesus said, not that I have come to abolish the law and the commandments. He said in Matthew 5, I have come to bring them into full operation. And I tell you that those who do them and teach others to do them will be great in the kingdom of heaven. And those who don't keep them and teach others not to keep them will be least in the kingdom of heaven. And he says, until heaven and earth pass away, in other words, until the Noah covenant is over and this creation is gone, not one jot, not one tittle, not one piece of a letter that distinguishes a letter, and not the smallest letter shall pass from the Torah or the law until it is all fulfilled. And it's not been all fulfilled. And so the argument that Jesus replaced that with a new covenant is not true. The new covenant is there to empower this covenant so that Israel will keep it in its fullness and God will be manifest in that context. And we'll see in the gospel that there is provision made also for us Gentiles in this context. So the Mosaic covenant is very important, that covenant with Israel, and it's still valid today for Israel. And they must struggle with that in diaspora and to some extent in the land, at what level that they can observe and what level they can do this while they await the promise of the change of heart and the regathering and restoration. And we'll talk about that next week. But I want to talk about the other covenant, the covenant with David. This is a covenant that many Christians don't know. And it's really important to understand this one because this is a covenant that really directly ties into some of the blessing and benefit of the Gentiles in the covenant and in the gospel. So in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 8, God says, "Now therefore you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture and following the sheep to be a ruler over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone and have cut off all your enemies from before you. Then I will make you great, like the names of the great men on the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them, that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again. Nor will the wicked afflict them any more as formerly." So he's saying to David, this kingdom is ultimately going to be that fulfillment of the Mosaic covenant. "Even from the day I commanded judges to be over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. And the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you, a dynasty for David." He says, "When the days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up descendants after you who will come from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Now he's talking about Solomon, but he's also talking about the son of David, the Messiah. He says, "I will be a father to him, he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness will not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne will be established forever." And so the prayer, the promise that God makes to David is, this is not a one-time thing. This is not, you're going to be king, and then Solomon will be king, and then there will be a few kings, and then it's all over. I will establish the throne of David permanently. And even though there will be a time when that throne is not in operation, ultimately, God is going to bring that back. And we see that promise in the book of Amos. So if you have your Bible, you can take a look in the prophets at the prophecy of Amos, chapter 9. In chapter 9 of Amos, verses 11 and 12, God says, "In that day I will raise up the fallen tent of David and wall up its breaches, and I will also raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this." So God says that the tent of David, the kingdom of David, the throne of David, is going to have this temporary falling. but I'm going to raise it back up. Now, I'm going to raise it up on earth in the land that I promised you. This is not a kingdom in heaven, though it is a heavenly kingdom. It is a kingdom on earth, and the throne of David is going to be on earth. So this one promised must sit on the throne of David, not sit on a throne in heaven. Again, this is where we confuse in Christianity a lot of issues. So let me show you a passage that ties these together. It's in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. In Luke chapter 1, beginning at verse 26, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city of Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, of the descendants of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And coming in, he said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." She was perplexed at his statement, and kept pondering what kind of greeting this was. And the angel said, "Don't be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Yeshua. The Lord saves. Jesus. Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end." Now, the promise is pretty clear. Jesus is going to sit on the throne of David. David did not have a heavenly throne. He had an earthly throne in the promised land. And that hasn't been fulfilled. I know the church says, well, he's up in heaven, he's ascended, and he's sitting on the throne. The Lamb is on the throne with the Father. That's great. He's sitting with his Father's throne, waiting until his enemies are put under his feet. And then his Father is going to give him a throne and give him a bride on this earth. And that's what the second coming is about. And we have to see Israel as central to all of this and not get lost in the Christianity of salvation only, heavenly salvation only. So he goes on to say that this will happen. And so I want to bring one last passage to you. In Acts chapter 15, when the Gentiles began to believe in Jesus, they believed in him as the Jewish Messiah, and the church was trying, the early believers, the synagogue of Jesus, if you will, was trying to figure out what to do with these Gentiles. There had been Gentiles who had believed at Cornelius's house. We'll talk about that later. And Paul was beginning to bring the message to Gentiles. So what do? Do we circumcise them and make them become Jews so that they will join into the full covenant of Moses with us and the Abrahamic covenant? And then they will be saved because they're Israel? Or is he going to save nations as well, the Gentiles as well? Well, the verses that they go to, chapter 15, verse 15, they don't quote the Jeremiah passage about the new covenant. They quote the Amos passage, and they say, James said, "Brethren," verse 13 of Acts 15, "Brethren, listen to me. Simon has related how God first concerned himself by taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name." Not just the people of Israel, but a people from the nations. "And with these words, the prophets agree, just as it is written, after these things I will return, and I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which is fallen. And I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, so that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the nations and the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from long ago." So the argument then was that we're going to make these Gentiles not circumcise their children. They're not going into the Abrahamic covenant. Paul will say something about that. They're not going into the Mosaic covenant, but they are somehow attached to Israel as Gentiles, not as Jews, not as Israel. And they will obey certain commandments, and 4 of them are given from Leviticus. These commandments are the commandment to stay away from blood, from things sacrificed to idols, from fornication, and from idolatry. And we'll talk about those later when we talk about the gospel and we talk about the Gentiles. But it's important to understand that the Davidic covenant and the Mosaic covenant are important and must still be in place for Jesus to be the Messiah and for him to bring the Gentiles to salvation. So when we come to this idea that Gentiles are saved by a process that eliminates Israel and eliminates the Torah and eliminates the law, we err greatly, and we don't want to do that. So next week I'm going to talk about the new covenant, and I'm going to talk about the gospel, and specifically the mystery of the gospel that talks about the Gentiles coming into this salvation. So we've looked at the Noahic covenant, we've looked at the Abrahamic covenant, we've seen that they unfold, we've seen the Mosaic covenant unfolds even further. The Davidic covenant goes into more detail, and we're going to see that the new covenant with Israel and with Judah ultimately brings all of this into fullness. It doesn't fulfill it to remove it. It brings it into full operation according to the words of Moses and the words of Jesus. So think about that, and I will see you next week as we look at the new covenant and the gospel. See you then.